The Field of 68 Media Network presents Red is the New Orange, a Syracuse basketball podcast.
Vince intercepts a pass, breakaway for the freshman guard, he flies and slams! Aerial assault from Judah Mintz.
Looking to go back door to Bell, they get it to a near corner three, knocks it down! Chris Bell, the sharpshooter.
Bringing you everything you need to know out of the 315.
Up top, Williams surges ahead, up with the right hand and in. A pretty up and under move from Benny Williams to beat his man.
Over to Taylor, he skips into the lane, puts up a floater, and drops in.
Let's get it started with your host, Ian Unsworth and Johnny Gadamowitz.
Syracuse men's basketball has the week off, but we don't really take breaks here on Red is the New Orange. We've got another edition. Ian Unsworth, slightly under the weather today, but who really cares? Johnny Gadamowitz is also here as always. Johnny and I actually just celebrated his birthday last weekend in New York City. I think the LaGuardia Airport's responsible for my sickness,
yeah,
Johnny.
It caught up to you a little bit, I see, Ian, but that's okay. We roll on.
LaGuardia is a mall with planes. I think maybe the consumerism of Christmas got to me. We're joined today by a special guest, Shane Hoffmann, one of my best childhood friends. We went our separate ways for college. I went to Syracuse. Shane went to Oregon, and it just so happens that these two teams are playing this Sunday, 1 p.m. tip-off in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, at the Pentagon, of all places. Yes, it's really an arena shaped like a pentagon, a cool place for basketball, but neither Oregon nor Syracuse have any connections in South Dakota. So this should be rather interesting in terms of neutral siteness. And Shane, when you think of Syracuse and Oregon, at least for our perspective, the glory days were back in the early 2010s, whether Syracuse had Michael Carter-Williams, Oregon had Dylan Brooks, but Dana Altman is usually pretty good at taking whatever he's got and evolving. It seems like this year's roster's really changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about evolving. He's had to with this year's roster because of the injuries. Early season injuries have been kind of a staple of the past few seasons for Oregon, and they haven't been to March Madness now in 2+ years. And a big reason is they get behind the 8 ball, in a tough way in kind of November and December. This season's been no different. And Fale Dante, who is their best player for all intents and purposes, he was a first-team All-Conference player. He's out 2 months. He played 1 game this season. Nate Biddle, their backup center, who is then also starting next to him at times. He played a few games. I believe it was about 3, and then he got hurt, and he's out. Should be back maybe ahead of this Syracuse game. There's a chance, but he's been out for a month. And they've had, other injuries here and there to some guards. They're fantastic freshmen who I'm sure we'll talk more about. Jackson Shellstad has just returned recently. And then Jesse Zarzuela, another guard, has been out a few games. So he's had to kind of cobble together lineups. They don't really have any size right now, but they're winning. And so, at this juncture, it seems like if they can get guys back and they can kind of start piecing together some lineups, that they might be okay, but we'll see.
So then, Shane, I guess sort of the natural follow-up there. I mean, Dante goes down really at the start of the season. You mentioned Biddle, who you can loop in there as well. How did the identity in terms of kind of what this team brings to the table, X's and O's wise, shift the moment that those two injuries occurred, particularly Dante?
Well, it's as simple as they were a team that wanted to play inside out. And now they've had to, switch that on its head completely and rely on a pretty deep group of guards. That's the nice thing here is that despite the fact that they're, sorely lacking size, their only, quote unquote big man that they have is Mo Diawara, who transferred in this year. And then they have this, this another great freshman, Kwame Evans, but he's more of a forward. So they're running these kind of 4-guard lineups a lot of the time. And so they have, they have some returners in Jermaine Cousinard and Keyshawn Barthélemy, who had both transferred in last season and they stuck around, as well as, Brennan Rigsby, who was a JUCO kid. And then this year they've also added Jackson Shellstad, who was, phenomenal high school player in this area, went to Peyton Pritchard's high school. So there's some lineage there. And then they also brought in, a kind of a more bruising guard, Cario Aquino from Georgia, Jesse Zarzuela from Central Michigan, and then Jadrian Tracy, who is a bigger guard, maybe kind of like a forward, can shoot a little bit. And he came in from JUCO as well. So they've got all these kind of interchangeable guys. And I think the struggle for them now is just learning how to play defense with this group and how can they kind of scrape by on the boards as well.
Well, at least numbers wise, Oregon seems to be handling itself well. Top 50 in the country in both offensive and defensive efficiency, according to Ken Palm. And when you've got all these guys, right, this mishmash of guards, who's the main scorer if you had to pick one at this point? Because you gave us a bunch of names, Shane, but it doesn't sound
Right.
like anyone is ready to carry the torch.
Well, here's the thing. I would struggle to answer that because, to be quite honest, they came into the season, like we talked about, knowing that Dante was going to be the number one scorer. And then even, when Biddle was starting at center, he was leading them a lot. That being said, I don't know if there needs to be one torch carrier on this team, because you look at this guy. I mean, even look at this roster now. If you take out the averages from Dante and Biddle, given that they haven't played in a while, there are, by my count, I think there's 6 different guys that are scoring at least 9 points a game, and then Tracy's right behind him at 8. So they've gotten these guys to buy into where every game now, there's 3 or 4 guys in double digits, and it might be, a different person leading them on, different junctures. To be quite honest, though, the biggest thing that's contributed to the success, even if they don't have that one kind of go-to scorer, is that they're shooting the 3 really well. They're at 39% and 38.8. And the biggest thing you can point to in the last 3 years of why has this team kind of not fallen off, because they're winning 20 plus games every season, and they've been players in the postseason, but why are they not making March Madness runs or making the tournament? It's because they haven't been able to shoot the 3. They've been pretty abysmal the last 2 years. I think it was like 31%. And so that's up to, close to 39 now. And it makes all the difference. They're able to, really competently score now. So again, top 50 in offense, top 50 in defense, they're starting to figure it out.
Oregon still yet to play a Pac-12 game. They've got their conference opener coming up against USC at the end of the month. But Shane, you look at the results, and even despite those injuries, relatively speaking, they've weathered the storm. 7-2 through 9 games so far. Really, the only blip on their radar, that Emerald Coast Classic, where Santa Clara took them down, and then a single-digit loss to a ranked Bama team. Between those 2 games at the tail end of November that did not go the Ducks' way, were there any sort of commonalities, any sort of themes as far as what went wrong that, from a Syracuse standpoint, the Orange can try to replicate come this weekend?
Well, they got Oregon in shootouts both times. Both of those teams have guards that are really talented. Santa Clara had, I think it was Adama Ball, who used to be at Arizona, and he had 20 plus, nearly 30 points against them. And then, we all kind of know about the litany of guards and 3-point scorers that Bama's been able to put together on those rosters over the last few years. And it's interesting because the past few years, as I kind of started alluding to with the 3-point shooting there, Oregon is a team that's always been a good defensive team under Altman. That's how his teams win, and that's what he preaches. He's not going to run some sort of complicated offense, and he's not even been known to really develop players on offense in any kind of special way. They kind of just rise to the occasion. But defensively, they just struggled in those games. They got into shootouts, and they were scoring, high 80s, even, 90 points in one of those games. And that's something you weren't seeing in the past, but at the same time, it's rare that they would lose a game like that either. So I think if you really can get this kind of team into a track meet and try to maybe kind of bruise them a little bit down low when it does slow down in the half court, because that's the thing, is they're fast, they can shoot it, but at the same time, the rotation's a little bit smaller right now, and they have to play harder, to be quite honest, to make up for the lack of size.
Other thing we should mention about the lack of size, Oregon's best big man when it came to rating and pro potential last year, Khalil Ware, hit the portal and left for Indiana. So that's another big piece that Dana Altman doesn't have. I saw they were playing a walk-on against Cal Baptist as like a pseudo 5.
Well, here's the thing I'll say about Khalil Ware. I think you were alluding to his draft stock there, because he was absolutely not the most productive or most well-rounded big they had on the roster.
I just
And that's
meant
why
as
he
someone when you looked at the Oregon roster last year,
Absolutely.
he was a McDonald's All-American, like he had all the accolades. So that's why
100%.
him hitting the portal made such a big splash.
It did, and to be quite honest, I think it was just more than anything just a tough fit. Khalil Ware brings a few things that really stand out with his shot blocking and his ability as kind of a vertical athlete, as a lob catcher. But he was the only freshman on that team last year, and Altman during practices would just call him freshman. and he would kind of single him out a lot, and not to where he ran him out of town, and by any means, but there's a long history of one and done type of talents coming to Eugene and not being one and done type of talents when it's all said and done. They don't move on. They don't. I mean, there's several examples in recent years, and so to see him enter wasn't a shock. But to your point, I mean, he would be playing 20 plus minutes a game for this team easily because they're just shorthanded down there, and even their lone big man, I think he's like 6'8", 6'9", Mo Diawara.
Yeah, and Cooper's what, 6'7", and he's just a walk-on. So
Right, which is funny. They had to do this last year. They played Gabe Reichel a lot, a guard. I think he had something like 7 3-point attempts in one of their games, and they somehow won that game. I think it was against Villanova last year. So when you see these guys out there, I mean, part of you is like, well, that's kind of cool that these guys are getting a chance, but at the same time, it's indicative of where the roster is.
Shane, want to ask you about Altman. Obviously, you rewind to mid-2010s, racking up the accolades, Oregon teams that were consistent year in, year out. You mentioned how the past couple of years, the injury bug has sort of bitten this Ducks program. Amongst the fan base, to what extent are they willing to kind of give Altman that wiggle room and benefit of the doubt? You mentioned the lack of NCAA tournament appearances over the course of the past few years. Or is there a real sense of a desire for more, even with, the tough hand that they've been dealt as of recently?
I'm glad you asked. I think the goalposts have moved as Altman's had just, consistent success year after year. Because you look at their last 2 seasons that were, really viewed as huge disappointments in Eugene, and the turnout to games was pretty poor. There just wasn't much buzz around the team. Altman's not particularly an elite, promoter, I guess you could say, in an age where some coaches are. I mean, I think you guys all kind of think of a few people. There's one down at Arkansas that definitely comes to my mind. But you look at those seasons and they would be, some teams' best seasons in a decade. And so, like I said, the goalposts are moving, and I think because of that and because of the success he's had, there is some leeway there. But there was a pretty notable shift at the end of last season. They got knocked out in the NIT final by Wisconsin, and Allman had this kind of, I don't know if I call it a rant afterwards, but he kind of just went off on this long tangent about how, if it's me, I'll leave. That he doesn't want to have to promote the program, that, the play should promote the program, that guys just weren't sticking around working hard enough. I mean, just kind of a wide ranging
was it a boomer rant?
A little bit, yeah.
We've been through a few of those, let me tell you.
Yeah, right. So he had that moment, and that was a little bit of kind of a look in the mirror moment, I think, where he even came back, and even at the end of it, he's like, "You guys are going to skewer me. Please don't, do me too dirty in your stories and whatnot."
That never happened at Syracuse. Let's put that. There was no rescinding of comments at Syracuse.
But he's had his nights where he kind of just hops in the car, he says, and just drives down the highway and thinks about things. And I think it's been a big period of reflection these last few years. So I think they need to have success this year in a really meaningful way. I think they need to make the tournament because, again, the goalposts move, but then they don't shift back right away, right? Until you kind of overhaul this thing. So it's going to keep being high expectations in this city. And I think what helps too is that they have some hometown kids. Jackson Shellstad's been fantastic since he came back from injury. I mean, he's only played at this point 5 games, but he's averaging 12 games, shooting 42% from 3. He's instantly kind of given them juice in transition with his speed. And then the other one is Mookie Cook, who was their top recruit they brought in. And he hasn't played yet. He's supposed to play at some point this month, maybe early January, but he's been out with an injury also. And he had gone and played at a prep school, but he's from Portland originally as well. So I think that's giving this team some juice in terms of the local angle.
Well, we'll see if Oregon gets those guys back. We're going to zero in a bit more on this SU-Oregon matchup after a words from our friends at BetMGM.
As you guys know by now, we've partnered with BetMGM Sportsbook for this college basketball season. We're going to be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks and predictions throughout the college basketball season. And we are going to have special offers for you, the listeners and the viewers on the Field of 68 each and every week during the season. If you haven't signed up with BetMGM yet, use the bonus code FIELD1500 and you will get up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager on BetMGM Sportsbook. Here's what you got to do. Download the BetMGM app. Sign up using the bonus code FIELD1500. Deposit at least $10 and place your first wager on any game. You will receive up to $1,500 in bonus bets if that bet loses. Just make sure you use the bonus code FIELD1500 when you sign up. And remember, BetMGM is now available under one wallet in select states. As a New Jersey resident, this is super convenient for me when I have to go cover games in New York or Philly. When crossing state borders, just log into your existing account instead of having to create new accounts in each state that you go to. And most importantly, I got to let you know, we do have some fun stuff coming up for this college basketball season. Bet insurance tokens, college hoops odds boosts, my personal favorite, parlay odds boosts. So download the BetMGM app today.
So let's dive into the nitty gritty here. Syracuse and Oregon, 1 p.m. this Sunday. Ian Unsworth, Johnny Gadamowicz, and Shane Hoffmann of the I-5 corridor.
We should say 1 p.m. East Coast, Ian. Not to
yes,
cut you
1
off there,
p.m.
right?
East
Yes.
Coast, like brunch time for any Oregonians out there who happen to be tuning into our podcast, probably because of Shane's pretty face. So we talked a lot about Oregon's bevy of guards. However, they have to stop Judah Mintz. The hard charging, Rambo, if we're being completely honest, once he puts the ball on the floor and attacks the paint, he's going to put it up and put it in or get fouled. Shane, how does Oregon handle someone like Judah?
We said earlier, there's been some high scoring guards in those two losses that have hurt this team. I do think they are equipped to guard a dynamic guard. The problem is they just don't have rim protection. So it makes me wonder if Judah Mintz could be set up for a pretty big game. Again, he's going to have fresh bodies switching on to him the entire afternoon because, whether or not it's Oregon choosing to swap bodies or it's just pick and roll switches. They're all small guys that can stick with the guard. I'd imagine they start with Jermaine Couisnard on him. But again, I could see any of these guys really, like a quicker, faster Shellstad, a bigger, more kind of brawny Oquendo. And I think they'll just rotate from there. But again, if he's able to consistently get in the paint, I think he could have, 20 plus because, again, there's just not much size down there. And I think some of these guards and forwards play above their size defensively. But at the end of the day, an elite guard is an elite guard, and he's going to be able to score on these guys at some point.
Syracuse is coming off of back-to-back games where they have played two rather up-tempo, let's call it, teams in Cornell, and then Georgetown, who likes to shoot and take a lot of threes. The Orange did their job in limiting Georgetown from connecting on all those opportunities from beyond the arc. But Shane, as far as the tempo goes, you mentioned obviously this being a guard-heavy lineup and the size not necessarily checking all the boxes. And I guess a similar narrative can sort of be applied from a Syracuse standpoint as well. Naheem McLeod, the Orange big man who has seen limited minutes, particularly in these track meet style games. Do you see this kind of being a situation where Oregon tries to beat Syracuse at its own game, so to speak, in terms of getting up and down the court, who can do it more effectively?
I could see that. I think this team is leaning into its speed and the ability to play in transition more than it has in years past, just because of the personnel. This team reminds me a lot of Oregon's. I'm trying to get my years now. It's 2021. It was the year after the pandemic started, so we had that kind of weird locked down March Madness, and that was when they upset the second seed Iowa Hawkeyes and Luka Garza that year, and they played a 5-out. Where they just shot the hell out of the three ball and just ran. And this team is starting to give me making me reminisce on that team a little bit. So I could certainly see that. But at the end of the day, Altman's teams tend to settle into that they like to play in the high 60s to low 70s. And that's, many college basketball programs. But they're not going to be one of these teams consistently downing their opposition with 85 and hitting 15 threes per se and something like that. So I actually am curious to see how that works because Oregon has feasted against some slower teams, but they haven't, outside of that, the Emerald Classic that you said, I believe that's what it's called, with Santa Clara and Alabama, they haven't played a ton of up-tempo teams yet, at least on the same skill level.
Yeah, I would say that Alabama is probably the up-tempo of up-tempo teams, and probably Nate Oates, started his career at Buffalo. He's probably the best at teaching that sort of style. We didn't talk about it a whole lot, but the three-point shooting of Oregon, one of its best facets. Only one really clunker when it comes from shooting behind the arc, of 4 of 17 showing against UTEP. Did UTEP do anything specifically to stop Oregon from hitting the three, or was that just a one-off bad game?
It was a one-off bad game, I think. I mean, UTEP's not tremendously talented. It was a weird game. I mean, it was not very busy in there. Again, that's been this thing is they're just trying to get it back and buzzing where, the fans want to come see this team. And it doesn't help that there's not a number in front of the team, right? A ranking. But if you just like, even just looking down kind of the counting stats, I mean, there's just guys that have good numbers in that category this year, whereas the past few years they just haven't. I mean, there's some guys that I think will come back down to earth, right? I mean, you got four guys above, 42% right now. I don't see that happening the entire season, but it's a promising start.
So there's not necessarily anyone who's like a dead-eye shooter per se. Guys have just found their footing early on when it comes to, taking threes, because Syracuse against Cornell let up a ton of open threes, and Georgetown took a pretty decent amount too. It just so happens they didn't go in. But Syracuse at
Yeah.
times, and especially with the new man-to-man, you'll see some zone every once in a while. They will give up open threes just because they're still getting used to switching and handling pick and roll. Oh, someone left the weak side open, and there's an open three-point shot.
I mean, there's going to be chances to your point, and Oregon is only going to play one player that isn't competent beyond the arc in this game. That'll be Mo Diawara. And he might not even play all that much, to be honest. He's only averaging about 17 minutes a game. Often they're running, Kwame Evans at their center spot, or Jadrian Tracy as like the big quote unquote. And, those guys are closer to 20 points a game, and both of them 20 minutes a game, and both can shoot it a little bit. So I think there'll be opportunities, in terms of like who is the dead eye. Brennan Rigsby's been off to just a insanely hot start. I mean, he's shooting 52% from three, and he is a great shooter. He was consistently one of their better ones last year. Tracy's at 46, and then Shellstad at 42, and he's a guy that'll hurt you off the dribble with it too. Whereas, Tracy's more of a catch and shoot guy. Rigsby is a little bit more off the dribble, but especially Shellstad with his speed and his ball handling. He was just a killer pull-up shooter from everywhere in high school, and it's kind of looking like it's translating already.
It seems like this is the longest stretch that the Ducks have gone this year with the same starting five. They've gone 3 straight games with the same five: Rigsby, Shellstad, Cousinard, Evans, and Diawara. Shane, is it safe to say that, weathering the storm with all these injuries, that is the group moving forward? Or is this still a very much all hands on deck, mix and match kind of experiment, even as far as the starters go?
Altman's never been afraid to switch up lineups. That being said, when he finds a groove, he likes to just ride them. And he was 3-4 years ago at this point, he found this weird jumbo lineup that made no sense on paper. It had like 3 bigs damn near in it. They were playing like a 4 out of 3, and then it worked. I mean, they won like 8 of 10, and then ended up in the tournament. So he, when he locks in on something, he'll ride it. I think, Zarzuela is supposed to come back soon. Although Shellstad's looks so good, I'm not sure Zarzuela will get his starting job back, to be quite honest. But that being said, those 5 will start, and you'll see subs quick and often. I mean, there's gonna be a ton of different kind of rotations with these guards that they like to do. They'll have, any 3 to 4 of them out there at any given time. So it's not a group where it's going to be like a hockey sub thing, and it's also not going to be one where they just ride that one lineup too long.
So
I
it's
guarantee you they won't end with that group. Let me put it that way.
That's fair. On the Shellstad topic, Syracuse had Joe Girard. Same sort of deal. Girard was probably the greatest scorer in New York high school basketball. Comes to Syracuse, plays pretty well his freshman year, all things considered. Becomes a starter by what, Johnny? Game 3, game 4. Jalen Carey wasn't helping SU play winning basketball, so he rode the bench for the rest of the year.
Oh, yeah.
And then after his freshman year, Girard kind of just tailed off. He didn't seem like he improved that much. He's playing well this year at Clemson, but at Syracuse, the pressure, just the voices, I think all of that kind of got to him. At Oregon, with first Peyton Pritchard and now Shellstad, it doesn't seem to be the case. what helps make those hometown guys so effective at Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so cliche, and as a sports writer, I hate to say it, but they had just these killer work ethics. I mean, Pritchard was known as this guy who would be, like literally dribbling until his hands bled. um or practicing dribbling, I should say. Or, I know people that were in his apartment building in undergrad and would catch him at, midnight in the gym, and they are just dribbling on a weekend, right? So these just crazy work ethics, and then just this kind of killer mentality. And so Pritchard brought that for years. I mean, there was a senior starting at point guard when he got there all those years ago, and he told him, and he talked about this in media. He was like, "I'm going to take your job," and then he did it. And then he had a huge role on that Final Four team moving forward. He ended up being one of the best players ever to play in this program, and especially his senior year was just a tour de force. I think he scored 20 plus on every single Pac-12 team at one point that year. Um, Shellstad grew up idolizing him. That was his mentor, and I see a lot of similarities there. He's not quite as brawny yet and put together, but he's much faster. He's much more athletic. And so he brings this really scary mix of just that kind of killer mentality with a knockdown pull-up jumper and a really tight handle, to the point where I guess I'm not surprised that Shellstad's had such a strong start, and he hits this super deep three to win it against Michigan at the buzzer. And again, I'm sitting at home for that one, and I wasn't too shocked.
Shellstad, a guy who can make the Orange pay from downtown. Another guy who we mentioned briefly earlier, Shane, but want to ask you a little bit more about now is Jermaine Couisnard. One of the guys who is certainly a focal point of what this Ducks team likes to do on both ends. What does he kind of bring to the table from an Oregon standpoint?
You mentioned the both end. I mean, he's a great two-way player. He's older. He's been around. He came over from South Carolina ahead of last season, and then he dealt with kind of nagging injuries last season. Again, a theme. He's settling in around 37% from three, which is where I could see him being for most of the season. He's pretty well rounded in that he doesn't get too locked in on any one thing offensively. He can play make a little bit. He's kind of just in a lot of ways, the steadying force with a group of kind of, so hodgepodge just thrown together with all these guards. He's the guy that I think at times, against Michigan, it was Shellstad, but I think towards the end of the game, they wouldn't mind if he's the one kind of creating out of some looks.
So we'll keep an eye out for both Shellstad and Couisnard. Shane, rebounding, an X factor for both of these teams. People have always complained that Syracuse never rebounded well out of the zone, and Oregon over its past 4 or 5 games has sort of tailed down on the rebounding side just because of a lack of size at that point. How does Oregon rebound at a higher clip?
Well, it helps that they've got a coach who's a stickler for it. I mean, I mentioned Allman's defense earlier. Defense and rebounding is this coach's lifeblood in a lot of ways, and he just doesn't play guys that don't hustle and don't really grind. And I think that's probably where some of the frustration arose with Kalawera a year ago. Again, it sounds cliche, but it's just got to be a team effort. I mean, they're never going to be outsizing people until they get their big guys back. I mean, once you get Biddle back and then, subsequently Dante, the issue is kind of erased all of a sudden. I mean, in Dante's lone game, he had 21 rebounds against Georgia. That being said, until then, they have to rely, especially on a guy like Kwame Evans to rebound, on a guy like Jadrian Tracy, who are these wings with a little bit more size. Again, if they get a Mookie Cook back, he's like 6'6", 6'7". They have to gang rebound, and they have to kind of just crash in a lot of ways. And that being said, I think they want to, because it's been so easy to get transition offense out of missed shots, that I think if you can kind of convince these guards like, hey, the payoff is on the other end of the court. If we can just get the damn ball, we'll get down there quick.
That seems to be the way Syracuse could convince its guards to rebound, because, hey, the Orange want to run up and down the court. We'll see if the Sioux Falls Showdown, I don't even know if there's not a name for it. They just happen to be playing some neutral site game. We'll see if it turns into the Sioux Falls shootout between Oregon and Syracuse. Shane, thank you again for your time and all the insight on the Ducks.
Absolutely. Appreciate you guys having me on.
F68_Cuse is the place to follow us on Twitter. I'm at _. Johnny is at Johnny Gwitz, and Shane is Shane_Hoffmann, 2 F's, 2 N's. If you want any more insight on Oregon Ducks basketball, or Oregon State for that matter, you can check out his work at the I-5 corridor. Make sure also to check out the Field of 68 After Dark and the podcast network, both on YouTube and Twitter. And thank you so much for sticking with us, including my raspy voice, until the end here. Enjoy your weekend.
Drops, Ian.
Yeah, I've got plenty more, Johnny. Enjoy your weekend, guys.